All right, welcome to our discussion on personality. And what I first want to talk about is, before we get into the specifics, the way that psychologists define personality is probably today, is probably, and the way you think about personality, uh, akin to what modern personality researchers think of personality, and that is we think of it like a trait or a collection of traits. So if I asked you to describe someone's personality, you might say they're outgoing, they're friendly, they're honest, and those would be characteristics that you're saying to me, this is how this person always is. This is what their personality is. It's implying that these are stable aspects of who they are, and they are like that in pretty much every situation that they're in. So they're sort of consistent aspects of their character, of who they are. And that's the trait approach. But there are other approaches to personality that we're going to be discussing, and we'll talk about that, and that'll give us a different perspective on different ideas about the nature of personality. One of the earliest, of course, is our friend Sigmund Freud from late 1800s, early 1900s. And Freud, when we're talking about, uh, want to talk in some detail about his view of personality because it's so influential on just Freud's overall theory. Is very influential in trying to understand personality, but also his view on abnormal psych and how to do therapy and so on, also very influential. Now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of his ideas were correct. A lot of his things that he talked about were not supported by empirical data, um, although some of the things that he talked about, and I should say kind of a minority of things that he talked about, were supported by and are supported by the data, such as the concept of the unconscious, that there is not the way that Freud talks about it, but the idea that we can perceive information below the level of awareness, and that can have an influence on our behavior. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so Freud. Let's sort of go back to the beginning on Freud. He was a French. He was studying under a French physician named Charcot in the late 1800s, and he was doing work with this with Charcot, and they were seeing patients, mostly women, nearly exclusively women, starting to come to the clinic with symptoms that were physical. They were saying that, for example, I can't move my right arm, or I can't see out of my left eye, and they would examine them. There's no physical basis for that ailment, supposed ailment, and they started seeing more of these, and they called this disorder hysteria. These women, were hysterical. That some version of claiming a physical ailment where there is none. It's sort of all in your head, so to speak. Now, Freud was really fascinated with this, and I should say that right around this time there was another individual, Mesmer, who was going around to different doctor groups and showing doctors, instructing them on a new technique that he had to cure. One of the things that it could do, he claimed, was to cure people who had hysteria from their ailments. He called it the talking cure, and essentially what he was demonstrating was hypnosis. So he put this individual under hypnosis, and talk to them while they're in this altered state of consciousness. And then when he brought them out of hypnosis, their physical ailment was fixed. They were astonished. They said, I can see, on my left eye, or I can move my arm now. And Freud really was fascinated with this whole notion, and decided to explore it much further in their patients, Charcot's and Freud's patients. And what Freud started doing was really employing hypnosis, employing some of these techniques with his patients, and really taking note of some of the things that the patients were saying. And this led Freud to basically form the basis for his his understanding of how personality is constructed, how it's developed, the difference between conscious and the unconscious, and how to do therapy, and so on. So this was sort of the genesis of basically the whole psychoanalytic school of thought. So let's sort of pull back and focus a little bit more specifically on this unconscious and conscious idea. Now, it's not, Freud perhaps wasn't the only one that had talked about it, but he was one of the earliest to talk about the difference between conscious and unconscious. And what Freud said specifically was that, let me see if I can put this back here for a second. And I've got a different graphic here that I'll show you. It kind of looks like an iceberg. That he's essentially saying that there's a huge part of our brain that we don't have conscious access to. And he calls that the unconscious. And there's a small part that we are able to consciously be aware of and can think about and pull up information and so on. He says that information, some things get put into the unconscious that can have a negative effect on our overall behavior and the way we think and behave. And so the job of the therapist is to find out what's in the unconscious and somehow help that information get out. Somehow let that bad information out, those bad impulses out. And if you can get that out somehow, then therapeutically, then it won't have any more negative impact on the person's conscious behavior and feelings and thoughts. Okay, so according to Freud, personality is broken up it's constructed of three parts. We have the first part, which is the id. And the id is something that we were born with. And it operates on what he calls the pleasure principle. It seeks immediate gratification. So it's very basic, doesn't care about rules or laws. The operating principle for the id is, I want what I want right now. And of course, that doesn't really work very well in a civilized society. So you have to have something that goes against it to temper that. And he says that's why we have the superego, which the goal of the superego is to basically put a rein on the id impulses and have the person behave according to our values and our morals and beliefs. Now, the interesting thing about the superego is that it doesn't develop. We don't get that until age 5 or 6. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later. So prior to that, the kid is basically a little id machine. But right around the time when we develop the superego, we also develop the ego, and they're pretty much simultaneously. So the ego also comes out around 5 or 6. And the ego is kind of like the referee between the two. So the ego's job, as it says here, is let's see if we can gratify the id impulses, but in a socially acceptable way, in a way that's consistent with our values and our morals and society's laws. Okay. So, for example, the id might say, I'm gonna steal the, I want this candy. I'm gonna steal it right now. I don't have to pay for it. It's gonna take it and eat it. I don't care if it's against the law to take it without paying. And the superego is going to be saying, well, no, you can't do that. You can't have that because you have to pay. And of course, the ego would be saying, is there a way that we can find a happy medium? The ego will say something like, why don't you work to get money to be able to pay for that thing that you want? Right? So you have to delay your gratification a little bit. And then you'll be able to buy it. Okay. Now, and the ego operates on what we call the reality principle. Okay, so the id is the pleasure principle, the ego is the reality principle, and superego, we don't have any fancy principle name for the superego. Here's that slide that I was mentioning earlier. Now, and this is fairly common in most textbooks. They always have this analogy of for the conscious and unconscious as to a giant iceberg floating in the water. So the conscious, as you can see, is this tiny little bit that's poking up above the water, right, that we're aware of. And then you have this massive amount of stuff that's in our unconscious. Now on this slide, you have something called preconscious. I'm not really going to focus on that too much. We're just going to sort of call everything the unconscious. So you got the id, that's the ego, and the superego. Those are all, and we're not able to tap into any of that. Just a small amount in the conscious mind. Now, Freud's got a 5-stage model of development for the personality, and he calls it the psychosexual development. And the reason is, as you learn more about Freud, you learn that sex, and what he calls the libido, or sexual energy, is a strong driving force for a lot of what we do and the way we relate to others and what we think, according to Freud. So, now let's first talk about these stages. Oral stage, and I want to mention that the first 3 stages in the model, there is going to be a conflict, and the child can either be gratified too much or too little, and the conflict comes from how you handle this conflict. So for example, with the oral stage, right, the pleasure center is the mouth, so everything's going into the mouth with the baby, right, and feeding is a key activity. And here, weaning from breastfeeding, according to Freud, is the source of conflict. So babies can be either gratified too much by the mom breastfeeding the baby until the baby is probably a little more older than it should be, or gratifying too little, where the baby doesn't get very much contact with the mom breastfeeding, or it's inconsistent, or they're switched to the bottle earlier than most babies. Okay. Next, anal stage. Now, the pleasure center, according to Freud, is the tension and release of pooping. And if this is all new to you, it is as weird as it sounds to most people. Yeah, Freud had some unusual ideas. So pleasure through tension and release of pooping. So, and as you might know, this is the quote-unquote terrible twos. The big thing that's happening here is toilet training. Conflict with parents. So a big conflict here is, how do the parents handle toilet training? And we'll talk a little bit more about what happens if the baby is gratified too much or too little in the anal stage, and we'll talk about that. And then the last of the 3 stages where there's pleasure center and gratification too much and too little. Now here, Freud said that kids derive pleasure through their genitals. Now, Freud was very, very popular. He was like a rock star back in his time. But a lot of his followers got off the Freud train when Freud started writing about childhood masturbation and kids playing with their genitals. And he most likely meant, that it was that they were just they were noticing differences and maybe not necessarily masturbation per se. But people sort of interpreted it that way, and people thought, okay, you're getting into a weird area that we're not comfortable with, and so they left. They just sort of said, okay, I'm done. I'm not with you on this. So he lost a lot of followers in talking about this. But what he says, according to Freud, the conflict now is the parents saying to their kids, you can't do this in public. You can't, put your hand down your pants and be playing with yourself in public. And maybe they might say, well, we'd like you to not do it at all, but if you're going to do it at home, where nobody else can see. Now, the really crucial thing here that happens is the development of the superego during this age 4 to 6, and development of the ego, of course, as we mentioned earlier. All right. So now let's delve in a little further in talking about the development of the superego. What Freud says happens, let's start with boys, is something that he calls the Oedipus complex. It's spelled Oedipus, Oedipus. And what he says is that little boys decide around this time that they want all of mom's attention. They would much rather have all of mom's attention to themselves. And it brings them into conflict with the dad, because dad sometimes has mom's attention. And the boy becomes resentful toward the dad and wants dad out of the picture. Now, it's not some people said, oh, it wants to kill dad and have sex with the mom. Of course, that's not what Freud was talking about. It's that he wants just all of her attention, and he wants dad to get out of the way. So it brings him into conflict, and he's sort of wrestling with this idea that he doesn't like his dad, and he only wants to be with mom just for himself. But after a period of time, a couple things happen. One is the boy realizes that he notices that the mom and daughter, right, his sister, don't have this great thing that he and dad have. Right, they don't have a penis, but the dad and the little boy do. And so he thought, and this is what Freud calls castration anxiety. It makes the boy believe that, it leads the boys to believe that maybe the mom and my sister, made dad angry, and he chopped it off of them. He chopped theirs off because they messed with dad. Right, they made him too angry. So I sure as heck don't want that to happen to me. Right, the little boy's saying. So I don't want to fight with dad. Wow, So I'm going to try to be his friend. Try to, if you can't beat him, join him, kind of thing. And this is what we mean on this slide here: identification with the same-sex parent. That the boy starts then to say, well, if I can't have all of mom's attention, and I can't get dad out of the way, maybe if I take on some of his characteristics and and be like a mini me, right, like a dad, that try to be like dad, then later on when I'm older, I can find a wife who is like mom, right? Right, so I can't have mom per se, but I can maybe someday find someone like my mom. So he calls this, and basically what happens is when the boy starts trying to be like dad, he takes on dad's values, morals, beliefs, right, and takes those on to himself. He identifies with dad, and in so doing, that's how his superego develops. Right, the superego is all these things that he gets from dad, from identifying with dad. Okay. Now, at some point, someone asked Freud, this sounds really interesting. Does the same thing happen with girls? And Freud, being the sexist that he was, had never really given much thought to girls, what happens with girls. And he thought, as an afterthought, he said, well, sure, I suppose the same thing happens. And he called that the Electra complex, Electra. The Electra complex, he says, the same thing in the girls happens, that they want all of dad's attention and they want mom to get out of the way. But what Freud says happens here is at some point they just realize the futility of that and they just give up and they try to start adopting mom's values and morals and beliefs. But there's something that's different between the Oedipus, right, the identification in the boys, their process, versus the Electra complex. The boys, the thing that's driving his identification is that intense anxiety, the castration anxiety. And so you have this very strong motivator to strongly identify, and therefore you develop a really strong superego. With girls, he says, you don't have any of that anxiety driving their identification. You don't have any of that anxiety. So the process is, while it's still the same in terms of identification, it's very weak. And he says, so that results in a weak superego for women. And he says this fits with what we know about women. That is, their superegos are weak, they're emotionally unstable, they're sexually more promiscuous, and all kinds of negative characteristics. Again, sort of playing into his, this is driving from his negative views of women and sexist nature. Okay. And I should mention one other thing. Freud thought that women, they want to either directly or indirectly possess a penis. He calls this penis envy. And later, what other researchers sort of tongue-in-cheek said is, well, maybe it's not necessarily penis envy, but here's what some other researchers suggested, not tongue-in-cheek, but sort of more seriously, that the reason why Freud was talking about that in particular, that women want this thing that men have that they don't have, it wasn't the penis that they wanted. Most researchers would agree that it was rather the things that men had that women didn't have at the time, such as political power, economic power, social power, things like the right to vote. Right? Back then, women couldn't vote, and so on. So women were, compared to men, significantly limited in pretty much any area of society. And so, of course, they would like to have some equality, right? They would like to have the things that men had. Okay. Let's go on to the next stage, latency stage. Age 7 to 12. As you can see, the term latency sort of referring to not a lot going on, kind of, sexual impulses are dormant. The child is starting to look at same-sex friends and hobbies and academics. And then he said genital stage is age 12 and on, just like Piaget. Remember, he had his last stage was age 12 and on. Freud says that your goal here is to find love and get married and have kids and so on. So he's not really interested in basically this stage or this stage, right? The latency or the genital stage. Freud's really not interested in that. And the reason is because Freud says that your personality is developed by age 5 or 6. That by age 5 or 6, that's who you are, and that's not going to change. So what Freud's most interested in is what's going on, what are the dynamics happening between you and your parents, and your siblings and so on in these first crucial 5 or 6 years. So Freudian, if you go to see them, they're going to be talking about your earliest childhood memories and relationship with your mother and so on, trying to ascertain what was happening in this to develop your personality. Okay. Now, I want to talk about fixations at the very top up here. Fixations are what happens when you, in the first 3 stages of development, if you have a negative resolution of the conflict, if you're gratified either too much or too little, so what happens is you get sort of stuck. You get sort of like a kind of like a neurotic aspect that gets sort of sticks with you for the rest of your life in terms of your personality. So, for example, in the oral stage, if you're gratified too much, right? That is, if you were fed too much, for example, that might mean that the person then later in life might have eating disorders, let's say, either eating too much or too little. It could mean that they like to talk a lot, they like to sing. Anything pertaining to pleasure and the mouth, they maybe chew their pencils, they bite their nails, and sort of innumerable other things. So, and for someone who's fixated too little, right, gratified too little in terms of your oral pleasure, right, you might get some of the similar things, that the anxiety and mouth-related behavior. So again, eating disorders and chewing pencils and nails and talking a lot. Now, the second stage, the anal stage, is a little bit different in that if you're gratified too much, that is that the parent takes a laissez-faire attitude toward toilet training, that we'll get around to it when we get around to it. So maybe the kids wearing diapers longer than they should. They're older than they should. And that Freud calls the anal expulsive personality fixation. Anal expulsive. And what that means is they will grow up to be a person who's sort of messy and, not punctual, disorganized, maybe irresponsible. And someone who is gratified too little, that is, the parent has a lot of anxiety about the child and their toilet training, and talks about, look at the mess you made, and, sort of talking negatively to the child, making them feel anxious about, going poop. That anxiety translates over to the child. The child gets really anxious, right? And we call that anal retentive personality. And that later develops into someone who tends to be very neat, orderly, punctual, kind of wound up too tight. They're always sort of anxious. And then the phallic stage, if you're gratified too much or too little, has the same outcome, actually. That if you're gratified with the parent lets the child play with their genitals too much or too little, later on in life, the child will tend to grow up to be self-centered, narcissistic, arrogant, a rude kind of person, selfish. And again, those are the fixations that Freud talks about with regard to sort of a not great resolution of the conflicts in the first 3 stages. Okay. Now, Freud also talks about something called defense mechanisms, which your brain kind of automatically creates You don't have to consciously think of this and doing the, and also you don't have to think about doing them. Your brain automatically will do them. What these are sort of defenses for keeping that your brain has to keep uncomfortable or anxiety-provoking material from coming out of your unconscious into your consciousness. So you have these like maybe little walls, little defenses, and these things will prevent you from thinking about uncomfortable things. So the first one, for example, is repression. Now with repression, you just simply push the uncomfortable idea out of awareness. So whatever it is, whatever the uncomfortable thought is, put that out of awareness and repress it. Now with denial, you're simply denying the reality of that uncomfortable thought. That's actually the first stage in grief, and the 5 stages by Kubler-Ross, and that is denial. When you hear that a loved one, for example, has passed away or died in a car crash or something like that, we often will first deny that it's even real. This isn't real. I must be having a nightmare, so on. Next, we have projection. Now, with projection, what's happening is the uncomfortable thought is, of course, uncomfortable to you, so you try to redirect it towards someone else. So if someone's saying to you, you're really irresponsible. What you'll say, what you may say then is, hey, I'm not irresponsible. You're irresponsible, right? You flip it right back onto someone else, right? You're projecting your failings onto someone else. So, for example, someone says, "Oh, you're late to work today." Well, I would have been here right on time if Joe over here, at our company meeting, hadn't screwed up the reports, and I had to help Joe get them fixed. Right, so that's why Joe and I were late. So you're blaming, right? You're saying I'm not irresponsible. This other person's irresponsible. Okay. Now reaction formation is kind of interesting. That this is an idea I use an example of. Suppose someone is very homophobic. Let's say it's a guy. Let's say that he's looking through a magazine and he sees an ad, a male model, right, for some kind of fashion thing, some kind of fashion line, and he has a thought that pops into his head that says, very briefly, it says, "Oh, that's that male model, so he was a good-looking guy." Now, if the guy is homophobic, that thought is going to make him feel very anxious. He's going to say, "Oh my gosh, what was I just thinking?" And that thought, then he'll try to do things to convince others and himself that he is not gay or doesn't have any thoughts about, that he doesn't think that way about other men. And so what he may tend to do then is try to be overly masculine, overly stereotypically masculine in his behavior and the things that he says to other people and to himself, to convince himself. So that, and same thing, for example, another example might be, let's say, someone who's very religious and they have a thought that, let's say they have a thought about sex. Then they say to themselves, "Oh my gosh, I just had a sinful thought," right, or an impure thought. So they might then tend to, the reaction according to Freud is, that thought is so uncomfortable that they're going to try to one way of phrasing it is double down on their religiosity. And they're going to be super religious, right, to convince themselves and maybe God and the rest of the world that they are very religious and they're not the sinner, and so on. Now, rationalization is simply excuse making. That's all that is. Just making excuses. So, let's say, take the other example again of being late. let's say you're late, and let's say you're late more than once to meetings and so on, and someone says, what's going on? And it sounds like every time you're late, you have a really good reason. Oh, I was started late. There was this terrible traffic, and it could be that maybe there really was terrible traffic caused you to be late. And then the next time you're late, your alarm didn't go off the way it should, and so the uncomfortable thought that you're having is, I'm irresponsible, right? And I'm unreliable. I'm not a good employee, whatever. And you don't want that other people to think that either. So what you do is you make up excuses to say that I'm still a responsible person, but it's just these other things prevented me from, acting responsibly. So, but in the back of your mind, that, for example, you should leave earlier or take a different route, and allow yourself plenty of time to get to work early or on time. And with regard to your, if it's really important, if something's really important, you're going to have more than one way to wake up, right? Maybe have two or maybe even three alarms set, so that because you want to definitely be there for the meeting. Okay. Now, sublimation, according to Freud, is he makes this grand statement that it's the basis of all civilization. And what this is simply is that, let's say you have an uncomfortable thought or impulse, like you want to be very violent, or you want to, maybe it's a sexual impulse, and to you that's unacceptable. So what we'll do is our brain will convert it to a socially acceptable behavior. So let's say instead of smashing someone's face in, you will convert that energy to something more socially acceptable, like painting a nice piece of artwork, or being a great architect, or whatever it is. You're converting it into socially acceptable behavior. So he says that again, the basis for civilization. He says all artwork and anything we create, the basis of it is sublimated negative energy, according to Freud. Displacement is a defense mechanism whereby, let's say your boss, you have some source of something that causes you to want to react a certain way, but it's uncomfortable to have that thought that I shouldn't react that way. Like, let's say your boss yells at you, and maybe you thought unfairly. Well, that your first instinct is to say, yell back at your boss and tell them what you really think of them. But of course you can't. You have to bite your lip a little bit and hold it in and not say anything. And what Freud says is, what we're going to do is we're going to take that energy, we're going to redirect it, our impulse, to some other acceptable target, like your dog when you get home, right? Dog's all whoop, whoop, whoop. Yay, it's happy to see you, and then you're like, shut up, get out of here. Yelling at your dog. Or your spouse, your significant other. How was your day? Shut up, leave me alone, right? Or whatever you say. And that's what Freud says is displacement. So you're redirecting your negative impulse, your negative thoughts, right? Your negative impulses towards something that is not acceptable, a target that's not acceptable, to something that's more acceptable. Okay. Now, how do we measure personality? Researchers have different ways of trying to ascertain what your personality is like. And here now we're coming back to something. We're coming toward traits, a trait model. We'll get there in a second. But we can break down our tests of personality into two different types. We have objective, and then we have projective, and I'll talk about those in a minute. The objective tests are tests that there is actually a right or wrong answer. That's basically the definition of an objective test. There is a right or wrong answer. And a couple examples, the 16 PF by Cattell. We'll mention that in a minute. Maybe you've heard of the MMPI. The MMPI is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And that's 550 true-false items that measure 10 different subtests or subgroups within it. So, for example, there's measuring masculinity and femininity, measuring somatic concerns or bodily concerns, thought disorders, depression, and a number of other aspects of your personality. And it was revised in the 80s to the MMPI-2 to update some of the terms and so on. Okay. Now, the MMPI, the interesting thing about that is that it'll give you a profile on these 10 different subtests of how, whether or not your overall answers on all the particular items that make up, let's say, the depression aspect subtest. Is that a clinical level of depression, meaning that is it really unusual, very high, right? Then if it is beyond the norm, then we might look at that further. Same thing with all the other aspects of personality, right? Do you have somatic concerns? If that is off the charts, there's a paranoia scale, right? So it's like it's scale 6, which subtest 6. So if a researcher says this person's a high 6 to another clinician, the other clinician will know what they mean, that their clinical level of paranoia. Okay. Now, let's see. Let's go past this a little bit here. Here's the MMPI, and you can see the 10 different subtests on the left here. This is from the MMPI-2. And as you can see on the right, on the green, is the clinically significant range, right? And so there's only, and they have it broke down by before treatment, after treatment. So before is the blue line, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 scales where they're in the clinically significant range. They're the 2, 4, 5, and 7, right? Depression, psychopathic deviancy, like a sort of antisocial kind of person, masculinity, femininity, and then, of course, psychasthenia, anxiety, guilt, so on. And so what researchers do and clinicians do is they'll look at this whole profile and they'll say, a shorthand way of communicating their results on this is what I mentioned earlier. We'll say the whole person's a 2, 4, 5, 7, and the other researcher will know what that means and have a good idea of how to treat them. So it's a great measure and validated and highly reliable and used still today. Some employers use it as a screening device for people who are applying to their company. Now, projective tests tell us a little bit about the person's personality, but in a different way. Projective tests, there's no right or wrong answer. And what you're doing is you're presenting the person with an ambiguous stimulus, and you want them to react to it somehow. And based on their reactions, the clinician then tries to kind of read between the lines, try to figure out what are the concerns that are occupying the person. Now, the reason why projective tests are interesting also is that they're designed to get around defense mechanisms. Because we say there's no right or wrong answer, then we just want them to tell a story about this particular stimulus. Then, according to Freud and others, who have created this, that if you present these ambiguous stimuli, that people will project right onto this ambiguous stimulus their unconscious fears and impulses and wishes. And the job of a clinician is to find those in the things that the client says. So, for example, here's from one of the most famous projective tests, that is the Rorschach ink blot test. This is a sample ink blot. And right, it's just basically a bunch of ink, and then they fold the paper together, and then unfold it, and you've got this, right? These symmetrical. If you draw a line right, from right to left, in the middle of this, you can see that they're symmetrical. And you say, basically, what you say to the person is, "Tell me what you see. What is this?" And they can go on and on and on and talk about it as long as they want, and you record their answers verbatim. Now, this is a card from another projective test called the Thematic Apperception Test, the TAT. And it has a bunch of black and white charcoal drawings of men and women. And what you say is, tell me a story about this. What's happening here? Tell me a story about this card. And again, you record their answers verbatim. The job of a therapist is to find out, to kind of interpret the person's answers. For example, one simple way of interpreting it might be if all the cards that they see, every story that the person tells is telling a story about what happened before this, then that might be one interpretation of that might be that the person's living in the past, right? Or that they have a lot of regrets, right? Because they're constantly talking about the past, what happened before. That's an example, right, of how a clinician might approach that. But I want to go back to this and talk about this for a second. So the nice thing about the projective tests is that they are fairly effective at getting around defense mechanisms, but one of the criticisms is that there's a number of them. One of them is that they're very broad, blunt tools. There's not a lot of reliability and validity with them, and that's a fair criticism. But another one is specifically the TAT. They're all black and white charcoal drawings. What happened was you started getting a lot of, not started, but ever since it was created, you get a bias you're biasing the answers of the individual toward more sort of negative or gloomy or sad answers because of the nature of the stimulus. That they're black and white charcoal drawings, they're kind of, gloomy, and there's no color, there's no vibrancy. If I recall correctly, no one's smiling in any of the cards. I could be wrong on that, but it's been a number of years since I was trained on to administer that. When I got my master's, and we administered that to people as part of our training. And so the way that researchers today have gotten around that bias is to, instead of giving cards, they would do something like this. So, you can get around the gender bias, get around the race bias, get around the age bias, and this whole depression bias by simply saying something like this to the client. So they won't present a picture, they'll just say, "Tell me a story about a person who is sitting down on the floor and they're leaning up against the couch, they got their head on their arm, and maybe they're sleeping, maybe not, but tell me a story about that person." So now the person is much freer to imagine that particular scene, that unencumbered by or sort of biased by the any sort of suggestion of gender or race or age or anything. And so that's a much better approach. Okay. So now let's talk about the humanistic approach to personality. And the humanists, largely, the two most famous humanists are Maslow and Rogers. And they're kind of the anti-Freud approach. The humanists, Freud says, if we left people to their true selves, that is the id, that they would be, there'd be anarchy and chaos and, lawlessness and violence and, all kinds of craziness. So he's saying that the ultimate sort of nature of man, of humankind, is very aggressive and negative, and whereas the humanistic approach is opposite. They're saying that if you leave people to behave, to grow, that they're going to grow in a very positive way. everybody's basic impulse is to help others and be good. And so it's a very much more optimistic view of human nature. Now, what both so that's both Maslow and Rogers have that view of human nature. The slide that you're looking at right now, particular view of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, by the way, is probably the most influential of all therapists for today's clinicians. Today's clinicians, if you ask them who's most influential, in terms of guiding you and how you do therapy, most, I would say something like Carl Rogers would be right up there. And so what Rogers says simply is that if you go on the far left, right, we have a need for self-actualization, which your book may have talked about a little bit in the, but we didn't cover in our exam with motivation. But self-actualization is the growth toward your ultimate, fulfilling your ultimate potential. And we also have a need for positive regard, for high self-esteem, to view ourselves positively. So so he says there's ways that we can get there, to get those. One, on the very top right line, is we get unconditional positive regard from specifically our caregivers. Unconditional positive regard, he says, is crucial to making it so that we have a healthy personality development, and also get toward a place where we can maximize our potential to be who we ultimately could be. What that means, unconditional positive regard, is simply that your parents communicate to you overtly and covertly that they love you no matter what. So that they don't love you only sometimes. They love you all the time, and they're always there for you. They're always supporting you. That's crucial. And a lot of kids don't get that, unfortunately, and they get what's called conditional positive regard on the bottom, or what he calls conditions of worth, where the parent, either overtly or probably more frequently it's covertly, sort of subtly, is telling the child, I only like you or love you or value you when you, certain times, like for example, if you get certain grades, or if you do certain behaviors, then I will value you. But if you don't, then I don't care for you. I don't, you will disappoint me, and so on. They're not there for you. They don't support the person, the child. Those conditions of worth lead the child to feel that there's a discrepancy, as you can follow along on the bottom, between who they think they are and what their ideal should be, or who they should be, right? The oughts, their ideals and oughts. And of course, that leads to a whole slew of problems: sadness, disappointment, depression, anxiety, guilt, shame. The job of the therapist, according to Rogers, is to create a situation in therapy where they say overtly and sort of, in subtle ways too, that I care about you as a person. You are a person of worth. You have worth. You're, not saying, they're not going to say you're special or, important, but you are a worthwhile person. You have a lot to contribute. I care about you. And this is a safe place. I'm not going to judge you. And it's the whole purpose is to go back to the foundations of that child, that now adults, their personality, and try to repair those cracks and get rid of those discrepancies between the self and who they think they should be. Okay. And then finally, our last approach, the trait approach. The Big Five model came out in the 80s, and it's and was popularized, I should say, by a lot of research in the 80s. And this trait approach says, contrary, and I should backtrack for a second and say why we call it the Big Five. In personality research, one of the big questions is, in terms of traits, trait models, is how many basic traits are there? We have a lot of things called individual difference variables that we could say are function like traits, but they're not consistent enough that that we would accord them the status of a trait. So back in the I want to say the 40s or 50s, Eysenck was talking about 3 traits. Then you have Cattell talking about 16 traits. And now the big 5, these are sort of modern researchers still, and this is sort of still a popular approach, said that there's 5 traits. And we have them right here on the left: emotional stability, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. So, for example, and again, you think about a trait as a dimension, like on from left to right, like a line, just draw a line. And let's say extroverted and introverted, right? So, and extroverted, right? Some people are very extroverted, and on the other end of the line, some are introverted. But the point is, all of us can find we are located somewhere. Our particular personality is located on that particular dimension in terms of extroverted and introverted. Some of us might be more in the middle. Some might be slightly more toward the extroverted. Some might be even more toward the extroverted. You get the idea. We're like a little dot on that line. And that's the idea of traits. That everybody is somewhere on these lines. Think of these as 5 lines, right? And the anchors are presence of something, right? And sort of its opposite. So extroversion and introversion, openness and basically closed-mindedness, agreeableness and disagreeableness, and conscious and non-conscientiousness, and emotionally stable, emotionally we might call labile or fluctuating, right? Like kind of like a roller coaster. Okay. Lots of evidence that supports this model, but it's not to say that this is the do-all and be-all, right? As in anything in science, right? The most current and maybe it's heavily supported model could be overturned tomorrow. Someone might come up with a better model tomorrow that more parsimoniously accounts for more data, right? And it's the self-correcting nature of science. So right now we have the Big 5 model, and it's doing a pretty good job of accounting for a lot of the data with as few assumptions as possible. All right, that's our discussion on personality. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you at the next lecture.